I'm Kriti Shah, and this is my podcast, Have You Thought About? I'm a writer, journalist and poet, and I like to find out about what other people are doing, especially if they manage to blend together skills in unusual ways. In each edition, I'm going to chat with someone I find interesting and who's managed to fit things together in their life or profession that you just might not think of as an obvious match. You're about to hear me chatting with Gabi Fleury, a conservation biologist who is also a cancer survivor and a video game designer.
I'm a conservation biologist by training, and I work on something called human-wildlife interactions. So basically how humans interact with wildlife and that intersection there, which is sometimes positive, sometimes neutral, and sometimes negative. And I focus a little bit more on the negative side on something called human-wildlife conflict. And there's some controversy about whether we should be calling it conflict at all. But basically how humans and animals kind of need to work better together because there may be conflicting goals. So an example of that would be elephants eating crops or carnivores eating livestock. And I focus kind of more on the carnivore side in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically within Southern Africa at this point. So other fun things, I'm a board gamer, I'm a cosplayer, and I'm a professional writer as well. So I try to do a little bit of everything.
There's like loads and loads of things to think about. This is basically where this has come from in terms of people are doing amazing things out there. You're clearly not just doing one thing, two things. You seem to be doing it all. How much, brain space have you got left? Have you got any capacity to add on extra things, or is it at full capacity right now with all these different interdisciplinary things that you talk of?
That is a good question. Yeah, so I'm actually designing a video game with a friend to address fast fashion consumption. So that's kind of my other side project. So I'd say there's a little bit of brain space left, but I tend to kind of relax by watching TV when I get a chance. I am behind, but I am watching The Last of Us right now. And yeah, and hanging out with my kitten who may interrupt this interview. So hopefully not, but possibly.
We love a kitten. Sometimes I have family members decide it's okay, we'll just get involved. And I'm like, that's fine. But I came across you because I was on Twitter and it came up with this thing called black mammalogists. What is a mammologist? Is this to do with boobs? I keep thinking it's to do with boobs, but it's not, is it? It's something actually quite serious. But also, what is it? Because it sounds super, super cool. But I think a lot of people would be asking, what is this? In fact, I asked some children that I know. I said, do you know what one is? And they were like, no, you need to ask that. So here's your chance to educate.
Yeah, so it's the study of mammals. And it's which, lactate. So that's actually pretty close. So I never really thought of myself as a mammologist until I got involved in that group and in that kind of campaign, because we all come from very different backgrounds. Like I come from a very interdisciplinary background. Some people are kind of more like pure zoology background. Some people actually came through calling themselves mammalogists. So it's interesting that we kind of all found ourselves under this umbrella, but it's just people who study mammals essentially.
And I mean, you say you've got a kitten, but having did a little bit of reading, cheetahs came up quite prominently in relation to you.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess my key thing is, how do you go from perhaps, growing up, domestic pets, maybe kittens, to getting like proper full on hardcore into figuring out what's our relationship with these sometimes scary creatures that are out there when you're in the field, right?
You have to be respectful, I guess I'd term them. I wouldn't really think of them as scary, just respectful, right? They're powerful animals, right? So I think that it's kind of a hard question to answer because I've wanted to be in this field since I was 3. So anytime everyone asks the question of like, why do you want to be a conservation biologist? I'm like, before I had conscious thought, it's like, so yeah, I think a lot of it is I'm a cancer survivor. So I had osteosarcoma when I was a kid. And I loved African wild dogs and cheetahs specifically because they could run really fast. So it kind of started this really innocent like fascination of like, these are some really cool, fast, animals. And then when I got older, I realized, apart from habitat destruction, which we're all trying to address, human wildlife conflict is the second biggest impact on carnivore populations. So that's kind of where I got interested in that. And because I'm naturally kind of a very interdisciplinary person, kind of like I mentioned, it's a very interdisciplinary field, right? You have, animal behavior, you have political ecology, you have anthropology, you have cultural things, and all these things kind of tie together to be able to work on mitigating this problem. So it's one of those things where not only would I be able to do some good, about the wildlife that I care about, hopefully also reduce losses to farmers as well, which I also care about, as well as being able to, from an intellectual perspective, constantly be engaged because there's always something to learn. It's a very difficult problem. It's one of these what we call wicked problems. So problems that are incredibly difficult to solve. And I always like trying to solve the hardest problems. So I think that's why I'm in this field.
But that's the thing, like you're talking about sort of solving hard problems. We're going to go back to the gaming in a bit as well. But you're like, I want to do this. I was 3. I mean, I wanted to be a journalist since I was like 8, but 3, I was probably like still thinking about biscuits. I'm always thinking about biscuits. But how then do you go? Actually, this is how to have that, to have gone through what you've gone through, and then still have that drive to get to where you are now, bearing in mind that I'm sure you're no disrespect intended here. It's probably not the most well paid profession either. Like,
No.
how do you just sort of make sure that you sort of stay on that path and your thoughts, have you been thinking about this? You keep heading towards this, which has a lot of impact, actually, what you're doing.
Coming out of osteosarcoma, I think it was hard. But one of the things that it did give me was the sense that life is very limited and you don't know what will happen in the future. So that gave me a sense of mission. So I knew I cared about these species. I knew I cared about the people it affected. And I think it was kind of like, you only have one life and you got to go for it. Because the last thing I wanted was regret. And to be fair, I mean, like, I didn't know if the cancer would return or anything like that. So it was one of those things where I just kind of was like, this is what I want to do. And I'm willing to do, whatever it takes within reason, to pursue this goal, and to keep working on it. So that kind of kept me on a pretty single path.
Why carnivores?
But
Why not like a tortoise? Like something a little bit, with less teeth.
like, to be honest, they're cool. So when you're a little kid, like, they are really cool animals. I think everyone kind of is attracted to carnivores just because they're very interesting and they're beautiful all the time, or fascinating. But as I got older, they're the linchpins of ecosystems. A carnivore goes down, they affect herbivores, which affects the plant life, which affects the ecosystem. So if you take a carnivore out of the environment, they have a disproportionate impact on everything that happens. It's what we call a trophic cascade. That's one of the things that really interests me, because I'm like, this is a way that I can have an outsized impact by protecting those species that have trickle down effects if they're removed. So it's both kind of like, they're awesome and I'm really interested in these species in particular, but also I can protect the grass and the antelopes and everything else that gets affected when a carnivore is removed.
But what's also really interesting is that people talk about conservation now, they talk about climate change, nature's now no longer at a distance, like, even if you're in urban areas, if wherever you are. But you've been on that path since you're a kid, as you were. When you talk about the creatures that you're talking about, it's actually just reminding me of watching one of the BBC shows where they had, I have a feeling it's leopards, but I could be talking rubbish here. Was it leopards in Mumbai, where they're sort of wandering around, and they've sort of they've got the footage of them, but you don't necessarily realise that they're there. They are living in these urban areas alongside people, and that's the sort of thing, if I'm right in thinking, that you're also looking at. It's not just like, oh, let's look at wildlife, human wildlife conflict far away from like urban populations. No, actually, this is something that is infiltrating a lot of different spaces that anybody could end up falling into.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, like, we think of human wildlife conflict as, like I mentioned, elephants or leopards or something, exotic maybe. But for example, deer eating people's gardens, rabbits eating people's gardens would be considered human wildlife conflict. It's something that we deal with every day. Like, maybe, an animal runs across the road and you have to swerve to miss it. That's human wildlife conflict. So I think that it's kind of like a broader field than people understand. It's basically just, how do human and wildlife interact that have potentially negative consequences for one or either party. So the work I kind of call myself doing is, like, I like to call myself an interspecies diplomat. It's like, how do you find like the best middle ground between these different parties? And the complicated part of my work is coming in as an outsider and trying to make sure that I know my place as a scientist, in terms of, like, I consider myself a specialist in the science. But in terms of the cultural aspects, I will never know as much as the people who live there. So knowing, let them take the lead and know kind of where my abilities can be best used. So there's also kind of a sense of humility that I think you have to have in this work, and knowing that you don't know it all, and that you aren't an expert in that particular system in the way that the people who are from there are, and being able to work within kind of those cultural boundaries is really important.
From what you're saying, that's been quite sort of central to the way that you process and the way that you sort of move forwards. I guess, at what point did you realise that that has to be one of your top criteria? Because, as I said, not everyone does that. It's just like, okay, I'm here, I've done my studies, I know this, I know that, this is the way to do it. But that's not how it should be, right?
No, because when you think about just sustainability, right, they're the people who live there. Like, I might do a study and I hope to be engaged in those communities for the rest of my career, but I don't live there. they're not my wildlife. Does that make sense? So I think like I kind of address it from that, where it's like I'm fascinated by it, I want to help, and I've devoted my life to it, but I don't know what they know in terms of how that system works. And I think I came to it pretty early in my career, luckily, before I actually started doing a lot of field work. Because when I was at my undergraduate degree, which is in James Madison University in Virginia, there was actually a sizable Maasai population, which was really interesting. So the Maasai are people who live in southern Kenya and northern Tanzania. And a lot of the time, like, you know, they're livestock owners. They have cattle, and cattle are really important to the culture. And there was a Maasai guy who was doing a master's degree in my university in my program, and he was associated with my undergraduate thesis advisor. So I got to talk to him, and I think that was the moment where kind of like the real light bulb came on of like, oh wow, people really are affected by this, because it wasn't just the sense of like, oh, I could lose my livestock. It's, oh, losing my livestock has cultural connotations that affect my standing in the community. Oh, my kids might get attacked when they're walking, you know, when they're herding my animals, or I have to live in fear of, you know, elephants that could hurt me or my family, and kind of like the other costs, the opportunity costs of that, right? And the stress. And he was able to kind of explain to me, kind of scientist to scientist, like what he's seen people in his community go through, and then connect me to other people in the community within this little Virginia town, which was fascinating, without even stepping foot in Kenya yet. So I think that was a point where I was just like, wow, like I really need to listen and learn and slow down and not just rely on what I'm reading.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's you did something about like lights flashing. Ages ago, I did a story for World Service and came across lion lights. Came across the Maasai boy who created lion lights, and we went back to find out what happened to him, because we were interested in these stories of innovation. And it's like, hold on, people are coming up with ideas, but then what happens? What happens next? In his case, he got a bit screwed over trying to do a patent. So it's a little bit weird how this is all very sort of circular in terms of like, yes, I know what you're talking about. Oh my gosh, it's making me think. You are so super cool. It's too much. I can't deal with it. But in terms of being able to deal with it, can we talk about the games? Like, have you not made video games? Am I making this up?
Yeah, video games. It's something I'm working on right now with a colleague, and something I've done in the past. I enjoy gaming. I think interactive education is the future in trying to, you know, share information and also get people engaged. And it was interesting because so my mom is an opera director. Like, she used to direct operas. So I came from kind of a theatrical background. My dad's a gemologist, so I came from kind of science and art. But it was really cool because it's coming from that theatrical background. I would see how helpful skits were in outreach. So how she would, we lived in Alaska for my middle school years, and we would go, she did outreach into Inuit communities to do opera outreach. So we'd fly in these little planes, and I'd go in the middle school, and she would do opera outreach and be like, hey kids, this is what opera is. And they would sometimes share kind of like their cultural and their musical traditions as well, which is really cool. But there is a point to this. But basically, what was really cool is that I would see that when they were engaging, when they would do skits, and when they would kind of like bring people in, that's kind of when the light bulbs went on. And these kids that were just sitting there kind of crossing their arms like, oh, this is so silly, like why are we being made to do this, would suddenly get into it. And I was thinking back about, okay, how do we get people interested in environmental education? And it's like, we can't just talk to them. Like, we can't just say the information or have them regurgitate it. We need to get them engaged. And one of the best ways to do that is through interactive play. So that's kind of how I got into that side field.
This is so amazing. I feel literally like, oh my gosh, this is all very, very interconnected in this way. Like, how do you relax? How do you like, are your neurons constantly popping to each other? Like, honestly, what is going on?
I don't do a lot of relaxing, I'll be honest. I honestly find working on projects kind of relaxing. I know that's like the workaholic thing to say, but I do. But yeah, I think I'm very lucky that I get to pursue a lot of really interesting work.
But then also, how do you sustain yourself? So say somebody's like, oh, this sounds super cool, yeah, I want to get into it. As I say, this is not necessarily the most well-paid field that I'm in. We'll be poor together. But no, how are you sort of able to cope and be like, okay, I'm committed to this. This is important. Is it things like grants? Is it things like having to do some side hustles? How does it actually work in real life?
Yeah, it's actually kind of interesting. So in my field, it does tend to be people from higher socioeconomic strata to be able to deal with some of the things. And it does tend to be people who are not people of color. So that is pretty isolating as well. Going into the field, I kind of knew I was initially at a disadvantage because I couldn't pay to do 6 weeks in Borneo, you know, just like doing field work. because there's a lot of pay to play opportunities out there where you can get field work, but you'd have to pay for it or they wouldn't pay you. And I knew unpaid internships where I didn't get anything would be difficult. I also knew I couldn't pay to do anything. And there's also the years of education, and there's huge barriers to conservation. So first barrier is you have to be lucky enough to even know what conservation is, to even know that's a field you can do. And then at that point, say someone's interested in conservation, you have to get through at least a master's degree, which has to either come with funding or you have to come up with the funding yourself. So this was a mix of good luck and I think working really hard. So I was engaged at the right time in my undergraduate career by the right person who kind of led me in a path kind of towards what I'm doing now in terms of like formalizing it. But also I had a full ride for my master's because I had a Rotary grant. They usually fund political scientists, but I made the case that human welfare is inexorably tied to wildlife, and human wildlife conflict would fall under their purview. So by being able to do that, I was able to get a global grant that funded my master's degree, but hilariously only funded 1 year. So I had to find an accelerated master's degree. So I did my master's degree in 14 months in Cape Town, South Africa, and got it fully paid for. Luckily, once you have a PhD or you get into a PhD program, they're usually fully funded. You don't get paid much. And yeah, for equipment and stuff, it's all grants. So you become a really good grant writer. You get really good at being able to sell your work and being able to express, the importance of what you're doing. So you can, buy camera traps and things like that. So I would say that, and I say this to a lot of people who are interested in getting into conservation, if it's something that really drives you, if it's something that you like, you can't imagine doing anything else, this is what you want to do it. But no, it's hard. And it has to be worth it for you. It's not something to do on the lark because you think it sounds cool. It's something that you need to be able to protect your mental health and protect your time and protect, your relationships, because if you let it, it will eat everything in your life because it's all consuming, right? And you kind of have to be very focused to be successful because it is so competitive. It's like trying to be an astronaut. Like you need to be able to have boundaries. And I think being able, for me, carving out time for my relationships is important. Carving out time to do just fun things. Like I say, I cosplay, nothing to do with anything I do, but you have to protect that time. So I'd say that it is possible and to go for it if it's someone's dream, but it's not just kind of like, oh, I think I'll study animals. And, but I always say that like, if someone wants to do it, they can find a way to do it. You just have to be creative and not just kind of sit and wait around for opportunities. So I always see like when, the whole thing, like when a door closes, like a window will open. It's like, forget that, build a better door. Like, don't just wait for a window to open, like build your own, because, the world's not going to wait for you.
I love that. I think, yes, building a better door. That, why don't you get in, like, I tell you where you can make some extra money with your hustle, get that on a t-shirt, sell it. But it's also really weird you've just mentioned Rotary. So I didn't know this before, but I have a Rotary Peace Fellowship, and it's because I got a mid-career professional development fellowship funded by Rotary. So I'm like, fair enough. But it's also there because we were doing peace, and I started understanding more about sort of peace and conflict and people that were in the field. That's what triggered my interest in the human wildlife, like environmental stuff. I was like, why are we not talking more about the environment? Like, what's going on here? That's so weird. Like all these little interconnections that are happening. Is there anything else that I should be thinking about, that you should be thinking about? Should we be thinking more or thinking less?
Yeah, I think a big thing in conservation up and coming is the importance of collaboration and the importance of reducing egocentricity and focusing on the problems. And I think that's in a lot of fields. So that's just something that I try to think about, is that as I'm building my own career, how can I lend my skills to multidisciplinary projects? How can I make connections with people who do other things? So for example, this video game idea that I did, it was a human wildlife conflict video game. We designed 3 mini games around human wildlife conflict. And it was literally me and a software engineer friend who did it for free. And we did it over a year, and we did it in PowerPoint and free Unity game engine because we were poor. We did that. And then in terms of beta testing it, we literally dry emailed somebody I really respected and said, would you test this in your environmental education program in Mozambique? And luckily she said yes. And that helped us refine the game. And then we were able to publish a paper of it. So like, it's one of those things where, we kind of came from nothing and we were just like, this would be cool. And let's spend a couple hours a week doing it. And it was one of the hardest things I ever did because the entire thing had to have no text. We couldn't have any text because of, language barriers. You walk down the street in Africa, you hit like 15 different languages. And, we didn't want there to be any literacy barriers or anything like that, or to be any complications. So we had to explain like what a trophic cascade is, the thing we just talked about, in like PowerPoint art. Which took like 6 months of our lives. Just like literally, we would do like this little video where it was all PowerPoint art, and we would give it to our beta tester, and she would be like, okay, people got tripped up here. So we'd have to take it back and be like, okay, how do we explain it better? Until literally, and we did it until like the entire 42 people, not a single person was confused.
That's brilliant. On one hand, it's like no lingual, but on the other hand, it's multilingual because of the fact that it's able to sort of be translated that way. I love it. I absolutely love it. Again, years and years and years ago, I worked on a project where it's called "What Does Freedom Look Like?" and then we had to create a comic, but it had to be wordless because it had to go across all these language services. So we were very lucky in that I was able to go and get a guy called Grant Morrison, who was behind a lot of sort of superheroes. Mandem, he knows his stuff far more than I know it, but he was able to do it, and it was like, this is absolutely brilliant. But it's hard to be able to communicate something that you maybe talk about all the time, understand quite well, but need to make sure that people understand it if they have never even come across the concept before.
And also understanding that other people, they might not know exactly what you're doing, but they have their own valuable skill sets. So I think something as scientists we need to avoid is being so caught up in thinking that we know best, and acknowledging that there's other equally important skill sets that we don't have. And that's why collaboration is so important. So like, for example, like traditional ecological knowledge. There's so much knowledge in communities that are essential for solving these problems. They're not helplessly waiting for us to fix things. We're coming in from a different angle. So I think reframing it instead of it, we're parachuting down and we're saving the world. And, it's like, we're not. We are part of a bigger team of people already working on these things in their own countries. We're the specialists. We're not running the show.
The wonderful Gabi Fleury, who puts together video game designing, conservation biology and more, and makes it work. Do you have an interdisciplinary life? I'd love to hear from you, and maybe we can chat on this podcast that goes with my newsletter, which is called Have You Thought About, and can be found via www.drutishah.com. Thank you to Rian Shah for the music for this podcast.